Good morning. It's
Good morning.
Friday. How are you, Jocelyn?
How are you? I'm actually doing pretty well relative to things.
Me too. You know, I was wearing a black shirt,
I know.
and then it was super embarrassing, and you ended up wearing a black shirt too, so I put on a not black shirt.
I thought it looked wonderful, and I'm just going to throw that out there. And I think we should get, those pictures hosts get where they're like standing back to back in the same outfit.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need.
Yeah, like a 1980s style one, though, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Perfect.
Do we have Alex? It looks like we do have Alex.
I think we might. We do.
Hello.
Wonderful. We were dealing with some tech and internet issues, but we are joined by, in my view, the other Alex Lawson. But I'm sure in her view, I'm the other Alex Lawson. And I'm not saying that we're going to have like a Highlander style fight. There can be only one, unless you want to. I'm thinking that what we should discuss is how this town is actually big enough for two progressive Alex Lawsons. And in solidarity, we actually can get more than twice the amount done. Look out, bosses. There's two of us. So, Alex, we didn't even get to like sort of set up how this works. So we're just going to wing it with you, if that's okay. And I'm happy that we did figure out the tech. Generally, Jocelyn and I just go sort of back and forth, asking questions, talking about the stuff that we're going to talk about today. A lot of focus today is on the TRIPS waiver, or the Biden administration actually taking the right step and saying that we're going to put the public health before pharmaceutical corporations' intellectual property privileges. Which seems like a pretty no-brainer here in the middle of a global pandemic, but it wasn't, and it actually took a lot of organizing, a lot of fighting to make this happen. In fact, we had a rally that Will, our producer, was live streaming in front of Congress on the Mall, demanding this exact access. And this isn't the end of it. This is just the start of it. This is a first step. And we got to announce the partial win at that rally. But it's a global movement demanding this. I think that's something that I'd love to talk about. In America, we sometimes think that we're the only people that exist and are doing things. But in fact, this was a global solidarity, was what made this happen. So I don't know if you want to jump in right there on just what you saw. And I won't try to just sort of put you in a intra-leftist feuding box. Like, what did the dumb left think about this? Because I actually literally never care about the dumb left. And if I do have one disagreement with you, it's that because we share a name, that mess still comes onto my timeline, even though I mute it all. I mute all of them. Just mute.
I'm sorry.
And then I never have to deal with them because they don't exist anywhere except on Twitter drama. But we can sort of circle around that issue. I'd love to talk about, I know we generally know each other through social media. And I know you are talking about what that means. What does the TRIPS waiver mean? Like, what can we glean about the Biden administration's intentions from that move?
I think, for me, it's a really promising sign. Obviously Biden was pretty low on my list in the primary, but the fact that he can be pressured is remarkable. For the people that are saying, there's no difference between him and Trump or whatever, they're saying like Trump wouldn't have been open to pressure, right? So yeah, we shouldn't have had to ask this administration to do the right thing with regard to patents, in my opinion. But the fact that pressure does work, and we saw the same thing with the refugee cap. and a few other things is promising, because it means if we do stay organized and we do stay loud, that we can, we can push things in the right direction. Obviously, it's not going to be as far left as a progressive administration would be, but the fact that they are willing to even take on big pharma, which, we're activists. We don't have millions and millions of dollars in lobbying to spend on this administration. We just have our voices. So the fact that we can move this administration in the right direction, to me, is a really promising thing. And hopefully we can do the same thing on, student debt and some of the other really important issues that we have a chance on. I don't think we're going to get Medicare for all, but if we can get some movement on some of the issues like student debt and like maybe a public option by being loud, I think that's a great sign to me. I think it was a huge win, and I think sometimes in leftist circles you get so used to losing that you kind of don't know how to celebrate when you win. And like winning begets winning. And I think like if you really focus on celebrating your wins, you're going to keep people energized for the next win, versus like being like, well, he's probably not going to follow through on it anyway, or any of that stuff, which I have heard a little bit. But I'm like, you know what, we're seeing a movement in the right direction. The best thing you can do is encourage it, celebrate it, and keep pushing, because it's huge to be able, after 4 years of, awful things that you couldn't really push back on, to be able to have your voice at least heard.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. How about you, Alex? Are you anti-happiness?
No, and I also know exactly what Alex is talking about. We talk about it a lot here with Jocelyn and me about there's a deep I don't want to be like too mean about it, but like there's a deep cowardice in cynicism. Like, oh wow, how bold of you. You're so edgy. Nothing matters. Nihilism 2021. Whatever. Like, it's just super boring to me. And what I believe in is power. And power is when people are together, organized, standing in solidarity. The people united can never be defeated is not just a slogan. It's the actual truth that the bosses are afraid of. So I just think of cynicism as just kneeling in front of the bosses. It's laying down the sword because you're not willing to fight. Like, oh, I can't get everything I want, so I'm not going to fight to make people's lives a little bit better. For like on Medicare for All. I've been fighting for Medicare for All for a really long time. I'm not expecting to there's no legislative trick that's going to win you Medicare for All. Like, I fight the pharmaceutical industry. I moved to DC to get my master's to take on the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm still here 12 years later, still fighting them. And yes, it's terrible that, we don't win all the time. I was there when the deal was cut in the Obama administration with the pharmaceutical industry to get Obamacare across the line. They cut a deal with pharma. It was the sickest thing that I've seen. And I was hired to work on getting the grassroots behind Obamacare, which I'm super proud of. Medicaid expansion helps millions of people. But they came into my office and were like, hey, guess who we cut a deal with? Pharma. Isn't that wonderful? And I'm like, no. But I play chess. I am not looking at this as a one and done thing, right? Like, oh, I lost, so I'm going to give up. No, I spent time building power, learning, along the way. We have this infrastructure that we've built with Social Security Works, with act.tv, with all the stuff that we're doing. And we're going to keep taking a run at them. I fought in the fight over H.R. 3 last Congress, duked it out. What did Elizabeth Warren say? I love Senator Warren left the teeth and blood on the field to show, right? Like it was a huge fight with pharma hitting us as hard as they can, getting pharma Democrats, pouring money on them. But we got H.R. 3 across the finish line last Congress, and that's a starting point this Congress. So understanding that all of this builds on itself.
Okay,
right?
but I have it's something that I have been meaning to point out on this show, though. Like, what is the resource for people to actually follow legislation? because we all spend a lot of time on social media, and it's really fascinating. Like, I want some PhD to do a case study about how do things actually hit the internet sphere versus what is actually going on in Congress. Like, how do we bridge that disconnect?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I think it was Ryan Grimm was talking about this. He was saying, like, even like when, big bills like the PRO Act passed the House, like, you don't even hear about it. So it's, kind of like, we heard about like things like the Medicare for All forced to vote thing for 5 months. And then you don't actually hear about when huge things that actually could pass, like the PRO Act, like make it even through the House, like it gets no coverage. And it's such a massive important. That's my biggest like focus of this year, I think, is the PRO Act. Because if we really want to have power and pressure, and be able to move administrations in the right direction, we need a strong labor force. But yeah, you don't even hear about it half the time. So it's a really good question. I nerd out on C-SPAN, but I'm sure most people like really don't want to stare at C-SPAN for.
How many shows do we have to start? Do we just have to have like somebody with a camera be like, today, these are the progressive things that happen on the Hill? Be like Pete Callahan.
The key is it's hard, but it's why being organized is so important. It's why I have very little time for people who aren't organized. Like there's a deep arrogance in thinking that you can do it on your own. Like you can't. You can't actually follow all of the things that you need to follow to make an impact on progressive policy on your own. You just can't do it. So the skill that people need is to be good consumers of information by identifying our allies in the struggle, right? So like on the PRO Act, you got to know that I'm going to talk to CWA. I'm going to follow CWA and some of the more left unions and figure out what they're talking about on this. When it comes to Social Security, obviously come to Social Security Works, right? Like we're not able to do everything. And so anybody who feels that they can, I feel, just immediately mute them because they're not actually doing the work.
Alex, that's rude.
Jocelyn, I think you're sort of the emblem of solidarity, and you work with through email programs and all sorts of stuff. You work with tons around the movement, and that's where we all glean our information from, right? Like I don't try to go and tell Color of Change what to do when it comes to racial justice. I listen and then I stand in solidarity with our allies. There's a real need in the left space to realize that playing second fiddle is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. You need more than one instrument to make the sound sing. And so you don't need to be at the front of the line all the time. Alex, I know you fight sort of I think a very lonely rear guard action against some folks who really do seem to be in it for the clout. And I oftentimes am exasperated by you because I'm like, you're never going to get it across to them. They're never going to listen because you're like, maybe, just maybe you can focus on the policy. And I'm like, they don't care. They don't.
Okay. Wait, Alex, how did this journey start for you with the worst of the left?
I mean, I just kept seeing like people slowly turning on our allies, and it really started to upset me because it was, first it was like AOC, and then it was, the Squad, and then it was DSA. And at this point, it's like, well, what is it? Like, you're turning on the largest socialist organization in the country, who I don't care if you agree with our electoral strategy or not. Like, we do mutual aid, we do tenants union things, and all sorts of things that help people in their community. And you're turning on all of our allies in Congress. Like, you're leading people off a cliff. You're giving people nothing to do. And I started pushing back against it because I don't want to see people that are like new to progressive ideas following kind of like some of these bigger accounts that then are like leading people to a Patreon instead of to get them organized. Because for me, when I'm depressed about what's going on in Washington, I give some time with my DSA and I feel better because I feel like, okay, things can be moved and changed. Whereas I feel like I would be pretty depressed if I didn't organize. It can be very depressing. There's a lot of defeats. There's a lot of awful people with a lot of money really invested in things not progressing and not getting better. So I just see this nihilism, and I'm worried that like neophyte kind of like people coming around to the movement are going to get like thrown off a cliff basically with nowhere to organize, nothing to do. And then what is that? Like then it becomes defeatism, and then maybe you get this weird notion that you should ally with the right wing, and there's a lot of that going around now. So it's just not good. It's really bad for the movement.
It's and it's hard for me because I have a certain amount of emotional, I don't even want to call it empathy, but I feel like I kind of get it a little bit, like I remember like who I was when I was a teenager, just kind of like, everything is bad. That sort of information overwhelm, very adolescent response to the state of the world. And so I don't like hate these people, but it's very disturbing because you're right, Alex. These are people do make constructive changes that do have an impact on people's lives. And it's really not the case that before we bring down the whole capitalist, industrialist, patriarchy system, that there can be no good. Like if you get millions of more people healthcare, you just saved a bunch of lives. If you bring drug prices down even a little bit, you just saved a bunch of lives. That appeals to me. Mm-hmm. I don't want to die. I don't want other people to die. I realize these are controversial things I'm saying. It's just weird.
Yeah.
It's also a bad analysis. And we talked with Paul Farmer about this, what people miss is the pragmatic solidarity is actually the only way that you can achieve revolutionary change. The only way to change the system is to allow people to have enough freedom in their own lives to be free of the bosses, coming down on them and saying, you're going to die if you don't take this low-paying job because I've got your health care in my hand and I'll take it away from you and your family. If people have health care, the bosses no longer can turn it off over their head. And then they're going to be like, you know what? My wages are too low. Pragmatic solidarity that delivers wins for the people is actually shortening the path to big change, big structural systemic change. So I feel like that I don't think it's worthwhile arguing with people on Twitter because I like worry. I share the same worry, and they can really like harm people by pulling them this way. But the benefit or the like saving thing to me is that the younger people are already on from Twitter. They're like, oh, that's for old people. Like I'm still on Facebook because I'm old, but like I'm, like the Patreon folks. I love the idea that they lead them to Patreon and they don't lead them to being organized, right? Like if your end goal is subscribe to my podcast, then you're in it for the clout, not for the change. So like
that said, you should subscribe to our podcast, but continue.
That's true. But
we don't have a Patreon though.
We don't have a Patreon. I'd like to go back to getting organized a little bit though. Like you are repping DSA as a place to get organized, which is where I love sending people. My favorite thing to do when somebody, says, how can I get involved in something? I say, look around, find your people, right? Like maybe they have an idea of what sort of affinity they might have for some group that they can join. If they sort of don't, I always push people to DSA because of the ideological part. I'm an ideological person. Most people aren't, though. So I don't think the ideology is actually going to catch 90% of people, but it's for the power that comes with being in community, right? So DSA is a small d democratic organization that shows people what you can do, and all of the ugliness and sausage making of it and committees and all of the stuff that you're like, oh my God. But that's what it means. That's what actually you having a say in the direction of what we work on and what we do. So can you tell us a little bit, or people watching and listening, about like being involved in DSA, what it meant for you, and if you think I'm wildly off on my the power of the democratic structure, the small d democraticness of DSA, helping people understand what it means to actually be organized?
For me, it's a way of meeting people who have like the same goals, but like come from wildly different backgrounds. I'm in Vermont, so half of my DSA is like old hippies, which is kind of cool. Because like usually it skews younger, but up here in Vermont, it's all over the place. So that's cool. And there's a lot of educational opportunities. We do like book clubs, we do socialist night school. And then we do things with our tenants union. Here in Vermont, we have our own progressive parties. So we do some electoral work with them. And then, and then we submit things to like national, like for the convention or whatever, to see if we want to change the platform. If we want to work with something like I wanted to do stuff with ProAct locally, even though, it's like a national strategy right now. But I wanted to like see if we could organize our chapter. And so our chapter leader was like, send me like a write-up of like what you think we should do. And it basically, you send a proposal in, then people vote on it and they decide. So it's actually way more democratic than like our actual country. But it's kind of like how a democracy should work. It's really a, one person, one vote situation. And you really do have some power within the organization. But it's also just personally empowering, because if you're feeling depressed about like nothing's changing, but then like we just had an election for our mayor and we only lost by 129 votes against the incumbent, which is like crazy for a progressive candidate. And then we won every single thing on our charter. So like every single resolution on our charter did pass, and they were all really progressive resolutions. We also like replaced our city council with mostly DSA members, and we're like slowly reallocating police funds. So it's cool that like the local politics can kind of put things in perspective when you get a little bit depressed about the gridlock and the way that Washington seems like it's, the structure of our government is a nightmare, in my opinion. It's just like designed to be gridlocked all the time. But you see that, and then locally you get these wins. So it kind of keeps you going, and it makes you feel like you can make those changes kind of more nationally.
Absolutely. Jocelyn, I got to just do one loving making fun of Vermont here, and then I know I'm taking your question slot. And I won't be able to do the headline, but it's I call Vermont the socialist utopia of Vermont. And obviously there is no utopia, but Vermont is awesome. And you can Google this headline. There was one time a headline, Burlington City Council passes 100% of the things that they wanted to get done for the year and recesses half a year early. And then the whole article is just about how they're like, yep, we wanted to do the water stuff. We did it. We wanted to do that. And then they're like, we did all the things. So we're just going to recess out. We'll gavel in next year. And I was like, what? What is that? What is that? So, that the idea that government can function when you actually have engaged people. It's not like everyone agrees in Vermont, but I will say they don't suffer from like the nihilist Republican side stuff. They don't have power. So it's, you actually can do stuff. I'll toss it back to Jocelyn. Maybe I'll look up that headline so I can read it to you and you all can fact check me on how close I got to it.
No, I'm just like, I just have so much nostalgia right now. I love Vermont so much. And, it's a really interesting thing when you're thinking about how, I don't want to call Vermont a small state, because it is large in many ways, in heart and ideas. But seriously, like, Vermont gave us Bernie, and Bernie is altering the politiscape of this country in a huge way, in ways that'll reverberate for generations, ideally. And, it's the power of hope and the power of focusing on the positive I know I do this spiel every single show, but this was mind-blowing for me when I encountered, okay, so there's this whole thing, right, where for psychology as a discipline is only like 200 years old, really. And for most of those 200 years, they were focusing on negative psychology. Like, why are people depressed? Why are people schizophrenic? But these past 40 years, they've been focusing on positive psychology and are finding that when people are hopeful, when people focus on the positive, when people have supportive relationships, they're capable of superhuman feats, which is really, really important to know when we're politically organizing. Like this infighting thing, this negativity thing, that it literally shuts your brain down. It floods you with all the bad chemicals. Whereas when you feel hopeful and connected and as though the things you want are possible, you're obviously going to keep going and put it like, why would you put time into a fight if you don't think you can win?
Yeah.
And this, like, we have this caricature of like the cynical renegade. I've met a lot of cynics and they are not very renegade-like. They kind of just live in their parents' basements and don't do that much. No shame to the parents' basement, but I mean, am I
wrong? No, absolutely. I mean, I think I can tell you based on like how somebody tweets whether they like are organized in their community or not usually. Like all my DSAers and people that work outside DSA that also are part of other orgs, they're quick to celebrate wins, you know, they're on that hopium, you know, and people that are disorganized or, you know, not really contributing in their community tend to be more nihilistic. And it's not like a dunk as much as it's just very obvious that you have to, all politics is local politics, you know, changing a few people's lives by being able to like do mutual aid or like, you know, volunteer with Food Not Bombs or whatever locally just can change your entire outlook.
Well, and when you think about like the number of people, I mean, we're all going to get older, or at least ideally we're all going to get older. And, you know, you think about the number of people in this country like that are older and underserved and don't have kids that can take care of them and like all of these, or, you know, mothers that need childcare. There are so many ways that you can help people that will make the policies and the structural violence take it from this internet fight and into a space of people who are actually suffering. And it not only is better for, you know, the world when you're actually making outreach to people who are real and living, it's also better for your spirit. I mean, I don't want to. Do you guys remember House, that show House?
Yeah.
Who could forget? It was like the thing in the 2000s, early 2000s. I rewatched an episode semi-recently, and I was like, this is terrible. There's no way that a guy this hate-filled and negative and misogynistic would randomly solve all these people's lives. Do you guys remember that aspect of the show? How he's like this negative, horrible person? What were you gonna say, Alex? Sorry.
Oh, I like mainly that, you know, like that dude should lose his license like a long time ago, right? Because the show arc is like, you all are idiots. This is what it is. Oops, wrong. I was wrong, right? Like 4 times. It's like Murder, She Wrote. So I'm even older. So like if you go to Murder, She Wrote, you're like, well, when that woman comes to town, leave town because someone is gonna get murdered. Like that is a lot of murdering going around near this woman. So just leave. Yes, the house point you're making is not that. It's that that sort of deeply, like, how could he actually be beneficial when he is not able to make his own bed? There, in like almost all traditions, there's some piece that says you have to take care of yourself and your home, your family, before you try to do anything outside. And one of the most, I think it's a psychological thing. It's like people who can't face and work on themselves actually oftentimes are trying to fix things out here, but end up adding to chaos,
right?
Because they're not able to actually do the hard work of reflection on themselves.
And that's the thing. I think it's become almost an archetype level stereotype in this culture. This person who's filled with negativity and hate, but like they have the answers. When look, Joe Biden was also not my president. But I will say this. I think there is something kind of healing about a family man who clearly like loves his family in the White House again. Right? Now that obviously is not even a little bit a replacement for policy or anything that matters. But this public nihilism that both sides have imbibed in a very terrifying way is antithetical to true organizing. Whether we're married and have kids or not, like we need to be organizing for our families and the people we love. And this idea of the deeply dark, tormented, cynical, abusive person who still is trustworthy, that has to go. And it's everywhere.
No, absolutely. And like, as far as, what's good for organizing, like people are like, there's no difference if Trump had a second term or whatever, but it's really not true, because even if Joe Biden wasn't susceptible to pressure, having the like 5-alarm fire that we had for the last 4 years of shit just being crazy constantly, absolutely imperils your ability to get people organized, because people are so worried, like focusing on the latest outrage, the latest media cycle, whatever, that they're not actually building long-term power. So, I was just reading a book by David Rennan about fascism, and it talks a lot about the interwar Marxists and how they were like the best ones to understand fascism. Like a lot of other schools of thought got it wrong. And they were the ones that were like trying to build coalitions to prevent the fascism in the first place. And I think like the nihilism that leads you into like, there's no Trump, no difference between the Democrats and Republicans, whatever, as much as I get angry at Democrats and I think that they can be feckless and ineffective and all these things, there is a fundamental difference. There are people who are recognized as people by Democrats that aren't even recognized as people by Republicans. And if you have that, like, where one entire party is invalidating your existence and they're the ones in power, you're not going to be able to get people organized in an effective way, the way that you can when you have a little bit more peace and you can focus on like long-term goals. You're just fighting like the latest outrage instead of organizing for the future, which is what we're able to do now. So I think if you actually want to move towards like a more socialist, society, or like just even a more just society in any way, you need to try to like go for the harm reduction first, and then you build towards that power like in the meantime, even though you don't have what you want.
That is that's what I was talking about as well with pragmatic solidarity. You're stating like a fundamental concept that we believe in here and on the show, but also it's driven my entire organizing strategy. I come out of HIV clinics. That's where I don't come out of politics. I was working in clinics in a harm reduction model. And like that ethos that is fundamental to me. And also I was like, man, why is there so much broken? And it kept being like, oh, well, that's the policy. That's the policy. And I can tell heartbreaking stories of losing clients and, because the drugs are too expensive. And I'm like, they're not that. What does too expensive mean? That's why I moved to DC and got my master's in policy, because I'm like, okay, well, that's where the breaking is. And we're going to have to fix some of that. But if you are scrambling to live, if your existence is threatened at every moment, even if you just believe your existence is threatened, but if in, more conflict areas and crisis areas, if your actual existence is threatened, there is no way to organize when you are scrambling to find the resources to live and exist every day, which is why, the concepts of mutual aid and helping people live their actual lives in pragmatic solidarity. You can have conceptual solidarity all you want, and, we can sing together and it's like nice and everything. But if you're not making people's lives materially better in your organizing, then you are not going to be able to accomplish your goal, because people won't have the ability to do it. It actually will be only the people who sort of have the leisure time, money, resources will be able to do it. And everyone else will be in the scramble, the struggle to just exist. So that concept of pragmatic solidarity is at the core of so much of the organizing that we do, right? Like we want healthcare for everybody as a right in this country, for justice, because it's the just thing. We need that. But think of the power that it also gives in terms of pragmatic solidarity when people can't take your health away. When we talk about busting pharma's patents so that, you know, the public is actually, we pay for all the drugs that are coming onto the market. It's all taxpayer funded. We just hand over the patents to these companies because they own the politicians. When we talk about just rebuilding an entire different system and what that would mean, we want to do that because of justice, obviously. But imagine what it would do in terms of organizing power as well. When a person is no longer dependent on these corporations for the lives and well-being of themselves and their families, if it can't be turned off like a spigot, they lose the power of life and death over us. And then, man, are we going to have more time to stand together and organize together to demand more things. Some of the other stupidities that are right in front of our faces will come into a clearer focus, like student debt and why we should cancel all of it, right? Like the system is immoral. So this concept of pragmatic solidarity, I think that's the flavor that when I get it from somebody, like when I understand that they are there, they understand that to me is the marker of a sort of mature understanding and analysis of organizing. And I don't want to get into intra-leftist stuff, but there is an entire other strain that says actually you want the material case to be as bad as possible.
Yes.
And everything to be terrible. And that is going to foment, you know, in one go, a big revolution, and then everything gets better. And that's just, in Joe Biden's words, malarkey, total malarkey.
It's just such an old idea. And I mean,
exactly.
It's been around since the French Revolution, that idea has been around. And it is disproved by political history. It is disproved by social psychology. It is disproved by personal psychology. I mean, this idea that it makes sense if you're just having a conversation, well, surely the worse things get for people, then they will be very angry. But it is fundamentally detached from an understanding of the way people work. I mean, I think everybody on this call has been poor at some point. When I was at my most poor, I was still obviously a leftist, but I wasn't like getting off of my 14-hour shifts to be like, wow, you know what I should do? Some political organizing. No, I was tired. I wanted to go to bed and I didn't have any kids and I was super young. Like, why would making things worse for the single mother with 3 children lead her to more political organizing? Like, I would love to see that logic laid out. And, you know, I mean, one of the things I think a lot about when we talk about this, we have to accept that abuse and cruelty is baked into our society. It is baked into the way we view resource distribution, into the way we view each other. And I'm not really interested in a form of progressive organizing which just replicates that. You know, I'm interested in a form of progressive organizing which models kindness and community and an interest in real lives being made better, as better as possible.
Yeah. It's the same thing, I think, with getting mad at progressives in Congress because they aren't doing exactly what you want. Like, I think critique is okay. I don't agree with everything they've done, but there's just, even if you don't believe, I don't think all of our problems can even be solved electorally, but I do think that harm reduction is a massively important thing, and to have less Henry Quellers and more AOCs is going to ultimately be better for us as a society in Congress. We don't need Democrats that are kind of anti-immigrant and have these kind of Reaganite, beliefs, and when we can have people that will vote against like a bloated defense budget and things like that. So even if you don't agree with everything, they're not a hindrance. They're not stopping Medicare for all. They're not stopping good programs. They're not funding the war machine. And you keep getting more of those people, that's a massive amount of harm reduction. They're never going to be the vanguard of like, you know, a new era and a new kind of government, but they can definitely get less people hurt. So, you know, I mean, there's Democrats that fundamentally would be Republicans probably 30 years ago. And, you know, less of them and more AOCs is always going to be a net positive, whether you agree with everything she's done or you think she's been forceful enough or whatever, you know, they're not adding to the harm.
Can I, I hear an echo. I don't know.
Me too.
Oh, maybe turn my volume down.
I don't know if Will can see if that's on our end, but there's a slight echo still, so I'll just keep going. I oftentimes, Jocelyn's heard me tell this Marion Barry story so many times, but I learned much of my organizing on HIV policy in Washington, D.C. And Marion Barry who's the former mayor for life, Marion Barry, who people, if they believe the media, they only remember him as that mayor who smoked crack. Mm-hmm. If you're in DC, you remember him as, depends on where you are in DC, but as the Marion Barry Summer Youth Employment Program, which is actually one of the biggest pieces of pragmatic solidarity that you can get. He gave people jobs and it reduced violence. And it is still to this day one of the single best policies that and it's so simple. It's so simple. We'll just give people jobs. That's what will keep people out of trouble, kids out of trouble, and instill all of the right. I just like to shout that program out. This comment has nothing to do with it. It's just still, we at my radio station in Anacostia, we continue to get kids coming in from the program, training them up on the boards to do this kind of stuff. And it's just wonderful. But it's actually something that Marion Barry told me about this gives me hope too, because this is a long time ago now. So it's like some of the stuff we're talking about where you have these quote unquote leftists. I don't think they're actually on the left. They oftentimes, at least a bunch of them are actually paid by either the feds or the fascists. Like a solid amount of them get rich off of this. And, I'm like, okay, where'd that money come from, guys? Some of the podcast hosts and video hosts, they just stare into the algorithm too long, and then the algorithm stares back, and the algorithm builds Nazis. Which is just true right now. But I think there's also bags of cash handed to people to smash up the left, to keep the left not united, because they're scared of us when we're united. But it also does prey on a certain mindset that exists naturally in, I think, the left. And I will say, Michael Brooks used to always say, sympathy for the conned, none for the con men. And I really do believe that. We should have sympathy for people who believe. They've been told, if AOC or the left just didn't try harder, we would have it. There's some amount of people who just believe that because they've been told it. And I have sympathy for them. I'm willing to actually, work with them. I want them to join the movement. And that's who Marion Barry was telling me about to myself, that I was one of them at the time when we were organizing on HIV policy. Because we were building more and more people into our camp. We wanted free condom distribution, which we have now because of this organizing, needle exchange, which we have now because of this organizing, and a host of other policy changes. And it was when we were building power, my business partner at We Act Radio, Kimon Freeman, and I, building power just slowly but steadily. But I was hardcore, so I was like, people would join us and I would still be sort of against them. When a politician joined us, I'd be like, yeah, well, you should have been here the whole time. And it was Marion Barry who pulled me aside and was like, look, he's a hero of the civil rights era. He, marched at the left hand of Martin Luther King, and he's got his head caved in by fascist sheriffs, racist sheriffs. And he said one of the downfalls of the left is active perpetration and infiltration by the fascists, but then a susceptibility to this thing where when someone's walking towards you, you've convinced them they want to join with you, and we punch them in the face because they're walking towards us. And he's like, don't punch a person in the face when they're walking towards you. And what he meant was not literally, it's when we win, when we convince people and they're like, you know what? I did think that, pharma had a point on innovation, but now I see that they didn't. We should invite those people in. We actually have to have an inviting system. It has to come in like this. And he said, and the worst thing, Marion Barry told me, is our tendency to actually turn to the person who's closest to us and punch them in the face because they're closest to us, because we have the most access to them, right? So when you see the so-called leftists attacking AOC, it's because they're closest to them. And it's like they don't have the power to actually attack the power centers like pharma, hospital, big insurance. It's more difficult to do that. And so those two tendencies, the hope that I want to lay out for you, Alex, is that this isn't a new phenomenon. Like this like so-called left cabal are just inhabiting a space that's always been there and has always been dangerous to actual leftist organizing through infiltration, like COINTELPRO and other programs like that, and other just, I don't know why there's a susceptibility to it on the left, but it's not new. And the only thing that's new for me is, man, you can just mute them out of existence on Twitter. It's just like 7. It's like mute, and then they don't exist because they're not even trying to organize in the real world. And that to me is very useful, right? Like you and I, or us three, can organize in the real world. We can express power. They just yell at the clouds.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, I've been called a lib so many times, and it's like, call me a lib all you, I don't care. Like, it's going to be 4 of you guys, like, sitting in a room being like, we're the real leftists, like, I just want things to get better for people. I don't care if you want to call me a lib or this or that. Like, I know what I believe. I know what the ideal future that I like to see in this world, but in the meantime, I'm going to be happy when we get the Medicare age down to 55, right? Like, that's a huge win. Like, if we can bring more people into, or if we can get a good, solid public option, and then people can
built on traditional Medicare. That's the key,
right? So that we can see like what it's like when you have healthcare where you don't have to look at deductibles and things like that, right? Like, or, bring dental and vision in, like all these things that get us closer to that goal. I lived in England, and like, just as an aside, like, I lived in England and people would constantly say to me, like, I don't know how you live in America and you guys have to pay for your healthcare. It blows my mind. Like, people really couldn't understand it. And the NHS, like, people here love to talk about the NHS without knowing anything, but it was great. You go, I mean, they don't even ask for your NHS card. You just go, you get taken care of, you go home. I had a midwife when I was pregnant that was assigned to me. And doctors only make like 75,000 pounds a year. So they're not like doing it because they just want to make a lot of money. They actually really care about healing. And it was a wonderful experience. And you can't even the Tories, as much as they've tried to take the NHS away, they can't accomplish it because it's popular across the board. Like, the BNP people still support the NHS because you wouldn't dream of taking that away from people now. So it's like anything we get that's closer to what we want is going to bring more people in. And then if you try to take it away, like the ACA, you can't do it.
Yeah. Well, and oh no, now I'm what do I do?
Just go with it.
Okay. So I love that you bring that up, Alex, is because it's true. Like, what people need to realize is if we get a policy, it's much more difficult to take a policy away than it is to create a new one. And oh God, now I have like 15 minutes of things to say in 5. All right, I'm going to talk fast. So if, you read that book, Kill Switch, that recently came out.
But I got to get the last question, because it's going to be who's the other Alex Lawson. That's going to be the final, and it's going to be me and Alex, and we're going to have a showdown over that. So you have to give me a minute.
7 days of intense thought into 2 minutes, Alex. All right, I'm going to try. But the point of the whole filibuster fight, and the reason Republicans want to keep the filibuster, if this isn't clear to people, because I think it can come off as a very wonky argument, it is very difficult to create new policy, which we can use to our advantage. That means if we get a policy we want in, it's very difficult to get rid of it. It is much harder to work against the status quo, no matter who has power. Like, that's just a rule of politics. And topic switch, sort of. So this week I read this book, and I think everybody should read it. It looks like a psychology book, and there you would be wrong, because it is written by a man who does psychology with abusive men, right? And I just read it because it looked interesting, but the political implications for it are huge. He talks a lot about how in American culture, especially, we tend to think of abusers as being like, oh, they're mentally ill, or perhaps they're addicts or something. No, his point is that after decades of working with abusive people who exploit other people, they're actually not mentally ill. I mean, some are, but not really. They're probably not addicts, not any more than the normal population. What abusive, exploitative people have in common is that they get away with it, and it benefits them. Like, I'm sitting here reading this book like, holy goodness, because I too thought this, right? I sort of thought of abusive people as being like, something must be not quite right there. And the implications for our politics here are huge. It's not the case that the rich don't know what they're doing. It's not the case that Mitch McConnell wasn't loved as a child. The reality is these people do these things. Abusive, cruel, exploitative people treat people badly because it benefits them. And he talks about how, empathy for people who behave like that is a really bad plan, because they are relying on the empathy of good people to be like, oh, poor pharma, they work so hard. No, they are not sick. They are not confused. They're probably not alcoholics, not any more than the rest of us are. What they have is an advantage that is given to them in cruelty. And it is like, I really do think everybody should read this book, because we need to understand that when somebody is being cruel, it's possible they have a mental illness. It's much more likely that they are getting something from that cruelty and exploitation. Did I fit that in? Okay, good. Now we can have the Lawsonception showdown.
Well, Alex, do you have anything on that?
No, I think that's true. I think people were trying to explain Trump that way, trying to figure out what's wrong with him, and it's he's never had a consequence in his life for anything he's ever done. And the cruelty is the point. That article was, I think, pretty fundamentally correct. In that, I think to a degree, but really it's just about flexing power and what you can get from that power. But I think overall, the important thing is just to my takeaway from all the discourse that's been happening lately is that accepting the fact that politicians will disappoint you, even the ones that are your allies, is really important, and that they're not your allies anymore just because they don't disappoint you. Somebody in a comment thread somewhere, I can't remember now, they were Canadian, and they were saying you guys aren't used to having lefties in government, so you're not used to them not doing what you want. So it's that's true. They're not going to do every single thing we want the way we want it. We didn't hire puppets. It's, we didn't vote for people that are going to do exactly what we say. It's just people that believe the same things. So I think it's important to walk away from it as not just who's selling me out today. It's just which ways can I move, critique or push this person to do what I want, to do what I believe in. And also recognizing that they're up against, a power structure in the House that's I feel like books are going to be written once Pelosi and them leave, that are what it was like to be under that kind of rule for the last 20 years. But
So here's the Lawson Inception showdown. But first, I want to agree with you on the concept. I say it a little harsher for people because they throw electoralists at us, right? Like that we believe in politicians, and I'm like, no, you put too much faith in politicians. You who want to check out of this and like, oh, they sell. No, I don't believe in any politician, not even a single one. They will all disappoint you. As soon as you understand that you're not electing saints, this is the real world, not some figment. There is no Santa Claus. They're not going to deliver you all the presents. So that is a very realistic view. You're systematically trying to make things better and build a system change that then is very difficult to change back, as we've all noted. So here's the showdown, Alex. Have you been mistaken for me before?
I don't think. Oh no! Wait. Yes, one time.
What,
I think somebody got a Social Security Works email, and they were like, "Did you send me an email?"
Okay.
I was like, "No, that's not me."
So I have been mistaken for you, but so like it didn't, right? That was like a friend who saw our email. So tell that friend that they have really good ideas of being on our email list. And tell them that we had the Alex Lawson showdown. I have been confused for you multiple times. People jump in and they DM me on something and they're like, oh man, you're doing this, that, or the other thing. Why do people think you're a woman though? And I'm like, no, that's my name doppelganger, Alex Lawson.
Oh my God.
So Jocelyn, as the judge of this, I will concede that I believe I'm the other Alex Lawson because I get confused for Alex more times than she gets confused for me.
I'll try to stop fighting with the dum-dums.
But I'm going to leave it to you, Jocelyn. Who's Alex Lawson and who's the other Alex Lawson?
No, see, I believe I cede to the initial appraisal that this town is big enough for 2 Alex Lawsons. And through Alex Lawson's solidarity, we can accomplish more together than we could apart.
Oh, man. No way I can win money on that bet. It's just a push. We're both Alex Lawson, and it's wonderful. It was really fun having you on, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Why don't we give you the final word? Close us out. Let people know if you want them to check out any specific work that you're doing or anything, and say bye-bye.
Yeah, so the big thing is the PRO Act, and you can volunteer to make phone calls with DSA, with CWU, with AFL-CIO. There's tons of phone banking, text banking opportunities if you don't do the phone. We only need 4 more co-sponsors before we can get that on the floor in the House. In the Senate, it's already passed the House. We made 600,000 calls already, and it's just awesome. If you go to dsausa.org, you can sign up.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for joining us here on Solidarity Live. We'll see you again next week.
Bye.
Bye.